Hi guys! You thought it was all over, huh? But we still have a few codexes to get out of the way before I do the DLCs. Like, we still have DLCs, so this game is not over yet, I'm glad. So let's go learn some more. A lot of stuff that I missed out. Ecumenical Council. Ecumenical councils were gatherings of church representatives who negotiated and discussed matters of faith and addressed church governance. For example, the Great Council of Constance, 1414 to 1418, lasted 4 years and addressed issues of Reformation and the Papal Schism. Islam. The origins of Islam are linked to the Prophet Muhammad and the book Quran, which according to tradition was dictated to the Prophet by the Archangel Gabriel. Chronologically, the most important year is 622 AD, when Muhammad and his followers moved from Mecca to Medina. From there, during the 8th century, it spread rapidly throughout much of the Mediterranean, Persia, and the entire Iberian Peninsula, present-day Spain. But by then, it had already split into two dominant branches: Shiites, who believed the Muhammad designated Hazrat Ali as his successor, and Sunnis, who believed that Muhammad did not declare a successor. Islam teaches that God is one and indivisible. According to Muslims, Islam is the sole and original version of the faith proclaimed by earlier prophets such as Adam, Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. According to them, the Quran is literal and unalterable. The teachings are based on 5 pillars: the profession of faith, shahada, daily prayer, salah, almsgiving, zakat, fasting in the month of Ramadan, Saum, and the obligatory pilgrimage to Mecca, Hajj. Islamic law is called Sharia and touches every aspect of life from social organization to the environment, welfare, and banking. Although the major monotheistic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, are similar in many ways, their believers still engage in exhausting blood wars. At the time of our game, the Arabian Peninsula is in full bloom and is a center of culture, science, and scholarship. Although echoes of the Crusades still reverberate, trade with Arabs is brisk and migration is ongoing. Latin. It originated around Rome approximately in 7th century BC and subsequently became the official language of the Roman Empire, from where it spread to surrounding areas during the Roman expansions. Over time, its colloquial version, known as Vulgar Latin, evolved into modern Romance languages, French, Italian, Spanish, etc., and it also strongly influenced English. After the fall of the Roman Empire, Latin continued to be used as a universal language of scholars, the church, and diplomacy. Anyone who considered themselves educated had to understand and speak it. Learned books were written in Latin, it was spoken at universities and church councils, and it was the official language of documents. Without exaggeration, it was the only language that could be used for communication from Britain to the Byzantine Empire. As an international language, Latin persisted until the 15th century. With the advent of the Renaissance, it was then replaced by national languages. Old silver mining. The minerals mined in the Gutenberg belts, primarily galena, sphalerite, and chalcopyrite, were characterized by a low silver content, making its smelting a rather challenging process. Work in the smelters was continuous. Furnaces with open spouts for easier handling of metals were used, or more often, those with closed spouts for better temperature regulation. This refinement process was described in great detail, for instance, in Agricola's illustrated work from 1556. The medieval process of silver extraction consisted of 4 stages. Almost every step had to be repeated several times to achieve the desired result. The raw material structure and composition changed from the form of rocks and solidified slag to molten silver with lead impurities, and finally to a solid loaf of pure silver. The primary goal was to remove unwanted impurities and reduce the ore's weight to a minimum. The final phase, silver refining through the addition of a specific amount of pure lead and the separation process, cupellation, was known as far back as antiquity. Silver was melted with lead in a so-called cupellation bowl where unwanted mixtures of other metals were separated through air oxidation. Ore tax. The word urbura comes from the German urbor and means yield or revenue. This term refers to a form of tax, a tribute that miners paid to the monarch in kind in extracted resources in exchange for the right to mine metals within the territory of the Kingdom of Bohemia. According to mining law, it was literally the monarch's share of the profit from metal mining. Urbura was expressed as a portion of the mined metal, which was mostly used for coin production. The collection of urbura was overseen by royal officials known as urburers. The amount of urbura was determined based on shares and depended on the quality of the ore extracted, or quantity, sorry, not quality. Popinjay Shoot. It was a shooting competition to celebrate Pentecost, Whitsun, involving shooting with bows, crossbows, or guns at a live bird tied to a pole, later replaced by a wooden bird. The church criticized this custom and found it offensive because it was held on the feast of the descent of the Holy Spirit, whose symbolic representation is in the Holy Trinity is precisely a bird, a dove. Silver mining. Silver mining in Kutna began in the late 13th century and reached its peak during the 14th and 15th centuries. Research around the town has identified 14 to 15 previously exploited vein zones. At various times, there may have been at least 20, but more commonly 50 or even up to 200 independent mines along these zones. Around the year 1400, silver was mainly extracted in 4 to 5 mining zones known as Oleski, Rejski, Kokliki, Gravski, and partially Rovensky. The landscape around Kuttenberg was thus intersected by hundreds of mining corridors, and typical clearings appear due to extensive deforesting in the area. The first independent mine owners and later the monarch were unable to ensure the smooth operation of such extensive mines, so parts of them were leased for a share of the extracted ore. Approximately 20 to 30 miners worked in a single mine, while about 700 to 1,200 individuals contributed to overall silver production during this period. In addition to the miners themselves, many other workers processed the ore and performed various support tasks on the surface. This included operating and maintaining mining equipment, arranging material transport, and the work of craftsmen such as potters, charcoal burners, rope makers, and others. Each master of these trades had their assistants. Transporting people and materials to and from the mines required a large number of horse-drawn carts, stabling facilities, and of course, people to care for the animals. Skeleton in the tavern. Oh, this is one in the hole in the wall. Anyone who has ever visited the tavern frequented by Kuttenberg's poor, bearing the unflattering nickname of Hole in the Wall, surely noticed a local peculiarity: a skeleton sitting at a table. We borrowed it from the book Stare Nove Kutnohorske Provesti, Old New Kuttenberg Tales, by Jitka Jelinkova, who wrote that there used to be a gambling house in the lower town where miners would go to drink and gamble. But the miners' wives would not stand for it, so they hatched a secret plan. They bought a skeleton from the executioner's assistant and hung it in the gambling house in the closet where the cards were kept. They hoped that this would scare the men and make them give up their habit forever. But instead, the drunk men pulled the skeleton out of the closet, sat it at the table, and began to drink with it. To their dismay, the skeleton came to life as midnight struck and started to actually drink its beer while thrashing the inn. For our purposes, we have taken the liberty of borrowing the first part of this story. St. Wenceslas's crown. For the coronation of Charles IV as King of Bohemia, a new unique crown was made, the St. Wenceslas crown. It was made from the old Premislid crown, and the monarch himself dedicated it to St. Wenceslas. No Czech king was allowed to wear it. He could only borrow it for a fee on the occasion of his coronation. The crown is made of pure gold, adorned with gemstones and pearls, and is kept in a chamber with 7 locks above the St. Wenceslas Chapel in Prague Cathedral. The keys are held by the leaders of the Czech state, the president, the prime minister, the Archbishop of Prague, etc. There is a legend that if the crown is worn on the head of anyone other than the rightful Czech king, the wearer will soon die. It is reported that during World War II, the Nazi Reichsprotector for Bohemia and Moravia, Reinhard Heydrich, put it on and died shortly after at the hands of assassins. This story is probably apocryphal, but certainly interesting. I don't know if I'm saying some of these words right. Synagogue, the Jewish prayer hall used for religious services as well as for social and educational gatherings, is known in Hebrew as a house of prayer and Yiddish as a school. It serves the Jewish community as a center for both spiritual and social life. It is typically oriented towards the east, towards Jerusalem, with eastern walls housing an ark that contains the Torah scrolls. In the center of the synagogue is a raised platform called the bima, used for leading prayers and reading the Torah. In Orthodox communities, there are separate spaces for men and women, but in most Jewish congregations, the space is mixed. Jews celebrate their holy day on Saturday, Shabbat. But prayers are conducted every day. One of the oldest Gothic synagogues in Europe is located in Prague, the Old New Synagogue. Thunderstone. Numerous folk tales mention the thunderstone, an object that supposedly falls to the ground along with lightning during a storm. Sometimes it falls immediately, other times it appears only after 7 days, months, or even years. Its size is said to depend on the strength of the lightning, the depth it burrowed into upon impact, and the manner in which it later surfaced. This led to various popular beliefs about it, which, however, had little basis in reality. In fact, a thunderstone referred to various prehistoric stone tools or different types of stone, notable for their unusual color, shape, or unique location in the landscape. The thunderstone was reputedly believed to bring abundant crop and to protect fields from lightning, hail, and pests. One custom stemming from pagan traditions was, for example, placing a thunderstone into seeds at sowing time. The stone, however, had not only a magical but also a practical function. It was used to mark territorial boundaries and serve as a safeguard for clearly defined territory. Sometimes it could even become part of tools or weapons. Tournaments. The first tournaments took place in France in 10th century during the reign of Henry I. They quickly became a popular entertainment, initially at courts, later spreading throughout Europe and captivating people of all social standings. Tournaments were multi-day celebrations accompanied by actual combat and numerous ceremonies with symbolic significance, solemn religious services, feasts, dances, and more. Tournaments were organized by the nobility to celebrate the culmination of important political negotiations or extraordinary events such as coronations, royal weddings and engagements, oaths of allegiance, peace negotiations, and so forth. The aim was to demonstrate skill and mastery in combat, to shine in front of others, and often to receive substantial rewards. Tournaments were either individual, where two knights faced each other on horseback or on foot, or team-based, where two teams competed in the arena. In both cases, the objective was to knock the opponent to the ground without killing or seriously injuring them. Even so, injuries and even deaths were not uncommon. The church initially strongly opposed tournaments, and it wasn't until the 14th century that it lifted the general ban and allowed their organized and unpunished conduct. Town gates. City gates, there were always at least two, controlled the comings and goings of the city dwellers and collected tolls and duties from traders for goods they brought and sold. The ground level housed the armory and storage facilities, while the upper level created an astronomical clock or town clock. Featured. The typical gate tower was a lower or higher rectangular tower with a passageway and a drawbridge over the front moat. The walls of some cities also included a water gate, through which townspeople made their way to a water supply. Special entrances included gates designated for the executioner and his assistants, unclean people, and the so-called Jewish gates. After closing time, entry into the city was only possible with special permission from the councillors. Those who did not return in time had to sleep outside the walls. The gate was locked with a key, which was kept at night by the bailiff or the head of the city council. Towns and cities. In the Middle Ages, the merchant settlements and villages on major trade routes or around castles became the first towns. They were founded by specialized entrepreneurs, the so-called locators. Their task was to seek out settlers, prepare and apportion land and build a community. The rulers set down the rights and obligations concerning the locators and settlers, e.g., the level and method of collecting taxes and benefits, town privilege, rules of self-government, capital justice rights, trading, market rights and 1 mile selling rights, and brewing and handling beer, brewing rights. Newly established settlements and cities were often exempt from taxes for a certain period. Luta, which was derived from the name of many Czech villages. Lota. Towns were of different types: royal, seigneurial, mining, and dowry, which belonged to the queen. Seigneurial towns were divided into ecclesiastical, secular, feudal, and those of the royal chamber. Apart from the feudal settlements, towns were mostly rectangular in layout, with streets perpendicular to a central square featuring a town hall, market, and a church. Until the 14th century, the main streets and squares of the largest towns remained unpaved, uncobbled. Waste was emptied directly into the street or thrown into waste pits dug around the houses, despite the fact that sanitation had existed since antiquity. Gutters of rammed earth carried sewage and rainwater alongside the streets, and an unpleasant smell hovered over the towns. Settlements were surrounded by wooden palisades, and from the second half of the 13th century, walls which had to have at least 2 gates. Okay. Vineyards and wine production. Vineyards have had a tradition in Europe since ancient Greece, but it was in the Middle Ages that this noble profession truly flourished. Wine was brought to Bohemia by Charles IV, who had developed a taste for it in France and wanted it cultivated in our region. It was at the end of the 14th century that vineyards were established in Kuttenberg, Melnik, and Prague. The spread of vines was also facilitated by the warmer climate during the Middle Ages, allowing cultivation in otherwise agriculturally uninteresting locations, dry, rocky areas. You would have difficulty finding the familiar taste of today's wine in medieval wine due to the lack of preservatives, spices, or honey that were added to the wine, and it was often diluted with water because it was consumed throughout the day. Only with the discovery of the sulfur wick was it possible to properly disinfect barrels and preserve wine for longer periods, allowing for the abandonment of flavoring and preservatives. The vineyards themselves were most commonly planted on southern sunny slopes. The wine was either grown as a low bush or trained to climb poles. The modern system of wire rows was not yet used. Work in the vineyards was year-round. Pruning was done twice a year. The vineyards were often hoed, and pests and fungal and mildew disease had to be managed. The peak of the season was the harvest, and the subsequent marathon of processing the berries included pressing, straining, decanting into barrels, and then wine fermentation. Each monastery or private winemaker had their own carefully guarded procedures and methods. Water-driven sawmills. Water-poured sawmills have existed in Europe since the 4th century, and in Bohemia they date back to the Middle Ages. The earliest sawmills were equipped with only one machine, a single-frame, single-blade saw that cut the log in half. Over time, this was supplemented by a circular saw with a long movable table, which was used to cut the edge of boards vertically. Other innovations of the time included the extension and improvement of saw frame blades, but the system itself remained unchanged. Water motors were used to power both types of machine. See watermill. Now we can move on to characters. Albek of Uniczów, Czech physician, lawyer, provost of Vyšehrad, and Archbishop of Prague. From 1399, he was the personal physician of Wenceslas IV. By 1411, he was teaching medicine at the medical faculty of Charles University in Prague, where he dramatically raised the professional level and prestige of the entire faculty. Medicine was not yet recognized as one of the arts. After the death of Wenceslas IV, he became the personal physician to his brother Sigismund of Luxembourg, who elevated him to nobility for his services. During the Hussite Wars, Albek had to abandon all his properties and flee the country. From his extensive literary legacy, the most significant works are Compendium Medicinae, Medical Compendium, and Regimen Sanitatis Suvetularius, Rules for the Preservation of Health, intended for the general public. Italians at Sigismund's court. The presence of Italians played an enormous role at the court of the Luxembourg dynasty, both under Wenceslas and Sigismund. They brought news concerning papal politics and significantly influenced the election of the Holy Roman Emperor. While Wenceslas IV was supported by members of the Visconti family of Milan, Sigismund was backed by the wealthiest Florentines. Important positions in Sigismund's royal court were administered by, among others, Pipo Spano, known in Czech as Pipa Vlach. In a short and politically unstable period, he proved to be not only a capable merchant but also a military tactician. He was the first to organize a defense system in the Hungarian towns against attacks from the Ottoman Empire, for which Sigismund made him the chief commander of the Hungarian army. In 1403, Pipo saved the king from death during an attack by Hungarian barons. He later commanded soldiers in a campaign against Venice and the Hussites and was inducted into one of the most prestigious knightly orders of the time, the so-called Order of the Dragon. Why does this story kind of remind me of the story that Brabant was going on about? Is it Jitka or Jitka? Jitka of Constant, future wife of our Hans Capon, the daughter of Erhard the Elder of Constant and Jitka of Medritz. Unfortunately, we do not know exactly how the marriage was arranged, but it is reported that thanks to this marriage, Hans Capon expanded his domains in Moravia. He had a son named Hinz with Jitka. Hey, he said he was going to name it Henry. What a liar! Nicknamed the King of East Bohemia, a tireless organizer of the Bohemian political scene and the predecessor of the Hussite King George of Podiebrad. Otherwise, all we know about Jitka of Constant is that in 1408, Hans Capon granted her a dowry of 60,000 Pragroschen. Conrad of Vecta. Conrad of Vecta had a rather illustrious career. He started as a priest, but because he was skilled in handling finances, he entered the service of King Wenceslas IV and was a member of the Royal Council from 1398 to 1400. Later, he was appointed the Royal Mint Master and also held the offices of the Bishop of Verdun and Olomouc, and even Archbishop of Prague. As the highest-ranking Bohemian clergyman, he crowned Sigismund of Luxembourg as King of Bohemia after the death of Wenceslas IV, but he never became Sigismund's ally. After the outbreak of the Hussite uprising, he supported its ideals and ordained Hussite priests. However, this had fatal consequences for him. By joining the Hussites, the property of the Prague Archbishopric was secularized. The Bishop of Olomouc and Litomyshl had most of the Catholic priests renounce their allegiance to Conrad, and the Pope excommunicated him. He also lost the support of the emperor. Conrad was deprived of his office in 1425 and died forgotten in obscurity. At the time of our game, Conrad was a mere royal official. His dramatic career as a high-ranking clergyman had yet to come. Rabbi, a high religious authority in Judaism. The term translates as teacher, or also originally as lord or master. The title was first applied to scholars who could trace their learning in a continuous line back to Moses. Today, it is more associated with spiritual leaders of the Jewish community. The designation rabbi also mean a sense of respect and humility for any person educated in matters of Judaism and the so-called halakha, body of religious law. A rabbi is someone within the community who makes decisions about its affairs and has the final say in them, often also the one who spoke for the community externally. Radzig Kobyla. Not sure the date of birth, but until 1416. Radzig Kobyla was a Bohemian yeoman, the royal hetman of Wenceslas IV, and between 1410 and 1415, Burgrave of Vyšehrad. In 1403, he was the hetman in Silver Skalitz, where he oversaw silver mining. The king was known for his favor towards lower nobility, to whom he awarded high positions in return for their loyalty. Radzig was probably one of these, and likely a friend of the king. In 1403, Skalitz was besieged and burned to the ground by King Sigismund and his Cuman army. For his service and loyalty, King Wenceslas IV permitted Radzig to build his own castle at Veseli nad Savazu, Sasau. He was killed in 1416 in a tavern in Kuttenberg by a mob of miners incited by priests. They seized them in the inn where they were staying, cut their body into pieces, and threw them onto the street, where the mob vigorously stomped on their remains, and, singing joyful songs, went to the priest's house to be praised for the act that they had been encouraged to commit. This occurred when he was there to collect taxes for the king. Interestingly, 6 years earlier, he had likely been a robber knight. It is unclear from the sources how he returned to the king's service. Rosa Ruthard. Rosa Ruthard was not a documented historical figure. She is inspired by Rosina from Kuttenberg legend, which was adapted by Czech playwright Josef Kajetan Till. The story intrigues us, but ultimately we retain only her name from the tale of the daughter of a wealthy nobleman from the Ruthard family. The original legend goes like this. Rosa was the daughter of George Ruthard, a wealthy but very stingy townsman of Kuttenberg. She was beautiful and intelligent, so she had no shortage of suitors. However, her father feared this, as the last thing he wanted was to diminish his treasure with his daughter's dowry. He secured his wealth in a very cruel manner. He had his daughter bricked up in the same cellar where he kept his riches. Her ghost later haunted the house and its surroundings. People in the streets would hear crying at night. The spirit often appeared to the house's residences and predicted terrible misfortunes. This eventually came true. In 1648, the house collapsed, burying everyone inside. What in the... Sigismund of Luxembourg, February 14, 1368 till December 9, 1437. Sigismund of Luxembourg, son of Charles IV, and his fourth wife, Elizabeth of Pomerania, was king of Hungary and Croatia, then king of Germany, Bohemia, and Lombardy. His upbringing at the Hungarian court taught him the hard rules of politics. After his abduction by the Hungarian nobility, he hardened towards them and tried to increase his prestige by gaining the imperial title of his brother Wenceslas IV. Sigismund was rather positively received by the Bohemian nobility. However, some of them continued to support Wenceslas IV, which led to a prolonged military conflict. Sigismund, with the help of Bohemian and Moravian lords and an army reinforced by Cuman mercenaries, ravaged Bohemia in an attempt to destroy Wenceslas's allies. Eventually, however, he was forced to retreat back to Hungary to suppress a noble rebellion. He entered Bohemian history as an erudite, pragmatic ruler. He acted as a defender of Christianity against the expanding Ottoman Empire. After the death of his brother, he fought against the Hussite uprising, Which what? The Lords of Kunstant. Wojciech of Kunstant, whom the player meets at a council of lords loyal to King Wenceslas, is a composite of two real men of that name. The first was Wojciech of Kunstant and Podiebrad, a Moravian nobleman. We know that in 1353 he was given the title of favorite and royal cupbearer by Charles IV. Besides Podiebrad and many estates in Moravia, he owned a splendid house in Prague, which the king exempted from all taxes and fees. He later clashed with John Henry, the Moravian margrave and brother of Charles IV, over his unfinished castle at Obreny. After the king's intervention, he had to demolish the castle and reconcile with the margrave. In 1371, he took possession of the important castle of Lititz. His son, Wojciech of Kunstant, followed in his father's footsteps and became one of the richest and most influential nobles of his time. With his two wives, he fathered 4 sons. The third of these, Victor, was the father of the famous Czech king, George of Podiebrad. The House of Kunstant continued until the 16th century, when, having been one of the most numerous families up until then, it died out. Ulrich Wawak of Neuhaus. Twice during his life, he was appointed royal mint master, and after the outbreak of the Hussite uprising, he was one of the few representatives of the higher Czech nobility to join the rebels. We know nothing about his life before the outbreak of the uprising, except that in the years 1402, 1403, or 1404, during King Wenceslas's absence from Bohemia, he held the office of mint master. His later life is documented, during which he supported Jan Hus and complained to the king Sigismund about his burning. He initiated the negotiations of the Four Articles of Prague, which defined the direction and demands of the uprising, and was elected as a representative of the nobility to the provisional government at the Congress of Czaslau. He marched into battle alongside Jan Žižka, and in 1421 he became the Mint-Master of Kuttenberg for the second time. Oh. He fought alongside Jan Žižka. Wenceslas IV, 26th of February 1361 to 16th August 1419. Wenceslas IV, son of Charles IV and brother of Sigismund of Luxembourg, inherited the throne of Bohemia and the Holy Roman Empire, but was not as efficient as a politician as his father. He was criticized for his rule and behavior during his lifetime. Despite being prepared for leadership since childhood, he was plagued by many illnesses and later preferred spending time in leisure rather than fulfilling his duties. This led to many conflicts and wars, especially with his relatives. With his cousins Jobst and Prokop of Luxembourg, he fought the so-called Margraviate Wars over estates in Moravia. And with his brother Sigismund, he fought for sovereignty. His legitimacy as king was repeatedly questioned by the nobility because of his unwillingness to keep his commitments. He was even captured, first by the Bohemian nobility and then by his brother Sigismund. Wenceslas initially supported the reformist proposals of Jan Hus, but later sided with the Pope. In effect, he allowed the largest civil uprising in Europe, the Hussite Wars, to break out, which he did not live to see, as he died in 1419. After his death, Sigismund took the crown. Zimberg family. I remember these two. The first mention of the Zimberg family dates back to 1142, when an alleged ancestor of the family, Miroslav, founded Sedlec Monastery, the oldest Cistercian abbey in Bohemia. His origins are unknown, and the coat of arms, or silver and red battlements, is only documented in a seal from the 14th century. The original family seat is unknown, but according to legend, the Zimberg family themselves consider it to be a castle above the Verslitz Valley near Polikany. However, research here has only documented a nameless prehistoric and early medieval hill fort. Two other castles of the same name were founded by the family during the 14th century in Trnavka and near Korikany in Moravia. Notable members of the family were the brothers Jan Baslan Posey and Miroslav of Zimberg, who got into a dispute over their inheritance with their uncle Aleš. They became infamous as robber knights and mercenaries during the Hussite Wars. These are the two boys that I helped get their rundown fortress back, right? If I'm remembering correctly. All right, let's move on to society. I understand that down there it shows I don't have the full records. I think some of them are in books, so I'll have to do a separate one with books. Anyways, Brothers of Corpus Christi. In 1384, thanks to the financial support from the bequest of the townsman Heinlein Herxmid, the Kuttenberg Religious Brotherhood of Corpus Christi was founded. It was modeled after a similar brotherhood founded earlier in Prague. The brotherhood convinced the elite of Kuttenberg that by financially supporting the construction of religious buildings such as chapels, churches, hospitals, or at least altars, they would secure a lasting and respected position in the city. According to their beliefs, through these means, the burghers could gain not only societal recognition, but also heavenly salvation. Until then, decisions regarding all church buildings in Kuttenberg were made by the Sedlec Monastery, as well as on burial places or in the choice of patrons. However, to the displeasure of the abbot of Sedlec, the members of the brotherhood decided to first build a chapel dedicated to the cult they had chosen themselves. They planned to begin construction of a new parish church, which would also ensure independence from the monastery. The members of the Brotherhood were mostly townspeople, members of important Kuttenberg families such as Kaufmann, Pollners, Rosenthals, Naazes, and Piseks. Sources also mention 4 priests whose participation ensured the townsman's proper spiritual legacy. The Brotherhood obtained funds and papal indulgences for the buildings of the temple, thanks to its ties with the Prague canons and the Prague chapter. This enabled the members to influence spiritual matters, while at the same time defending their other power interests. Burial. Evidence of burials is as old as mankind itself, but Christianity radically influenced all burial practices and inextricably linked death with the need for church ritual and blessing. Before death, it was necessary to rid oneself of sin and to receive the last rites in uncertain cases, such as going into battle. Rituals were performed preventatively. The place of final rest was also important. It was considered best to be buried inside the church, walls, floor, or nearby, where cemeteries emerged. These cemeteries were an integral part of towns and villages and were often located in their center. It was common for people to meet, trade, and make contracts. The piety of cemeteries, as we know it today, did not exist. The dead and the living lived side by side. Only suicide criminals and the sick heretics, executioners, unknown strangers, and unbaptized children were buried outside the cemetery in unconsecrated ground. During plague epidemics and wars, burials in cemeteries were temporarily abandoned and mass graves were used. In later centuries, for hygiene reasons and to avoid water contamination, most of the old cemeteries were abandoned. Sometimes bodies were exhumed and burial moved outside of the city. It was common for people to make at least an oral will before dying. In the case of some property, at least part of it had to go to the church for mediating the passage to the afterlife. Burials were in plain wooden coffins or sacks, and the dead were dressed in shrouds. Costly and elaborate ceremonies were conducted at the funerals of rich people and rulers. Royal funerals were attended by thousands of people. Wealthy families had stone tombstones made at their final resting places. The custom of building separate mausoleums came later. Kuttenberg councillors. We reconstructed the Kuttenberg City Council primarily from names documented to have already been in the council. However, we often know little about the bearers of these names. Andreas Plummel in 1403, a bailiff of that name, did indeed serve in Kuttenberg. Wenceslas Suker was wealthy burgher, real person. His real name was Christopher. Prokop Eldris, gunsmith, fictional character. Jerome Naz, representative of the Kuttenberg patriarch family, probably never served on the council. Franz Rosenthal, wealthy coiner, was not on the council until 1412. Enderlin, swordsmith, burgher of that name, actually lived in Kuttenberg. Nicholas Krondel, armorsmith, fictional character. Havel, innkeeper, fictional character. Friedrich Kummel, wealthy burgher, real person. Life in a military camp. A military camp near Kuttenberg remained in place for several months, requiring all the essentials of civilian life, including field baths, an apothecary, a clergyman, a mess hall, supply tents, and a sizable contingent of courtesans and prostitutes. Many soldiers embark on their journey with their families, and hundreds of other civilians joined the camp for practical reasons. There was always a need for cobblers, armorers, blacksmiths, bakers, and others. As a result, there were often more non-combatants than soldiers in the camp. To sustain the camp, so-called provisioning units were sent out into the surrounding areas. These were soldiers charged with getting provisions at whatever cost. In calmer times, the provisioners normally paid peasants for their food. In more desperate times, they took what they could find. Getting enough sustenance for a crowd of many thousands was a question not only of survival, but of morale. Without morale, there was no army. Without an army, there is no campaign. Hygiene was a critical factor for any military campaign, as many campaigns ended due to epidemics of dysentery or typhus before they even began. Mining officials. For the proper organization, administration, and control of Kuttenberg mining, it was necessary by the end of the 13th century to appoint a considerable number of royal and supervisory officials and overseers. In addition to stewards who collected taxes from the mined ore, mining offices also employed urban clerks, miners, judges, or senior steigers. The internal operation of the mines was managed by mine masters, whoremasters from the German Bergmeister, other clerks, foremen, and others overseers. Steigers, or royal chief miners, oversaw the adherence to fiscal regulations within the mines. The chief mining officer leased mines and presided over mining courts. He was someone from Kuttenberg Council. In 1386, the office of the mintmaster was established, responsible for the administration of the mines, the quality and minting of coins, the collection of mining taxes, and the operation of mining activities. Mining offices not only supervised the miners and awarded benefits to them, but also helped secure wages, provided for the families of miners in the case of their death, and supported those who worked in difficult conditions. Those who took on flooded and abandoned mines were granted reduced mining taxes and other benefits. Monks and the monastic life. Every monastery, especially those of the Benedictine order, adhered to specific rules regarding time, activities, and the hierarchy within the monastery. Apart from the worship, devout reading, and transcribing, or illuminating books, monks also engaged in physical work. In addition, members of some monastic orders were not allowed any contact with the outside world from the movement of their ordination. They lived only within the cloister, the enclosed part of the monastery surrounded by the inner courtyard, where no lay person was allowed. Communication with the outside world was handled only by appointed elder monks and lay brothers who also managed the operation of the entire monastery complex. There were exceptions, however, such as when the monastery included a school, hospital, infirmarium, or medical workshop, where in times of need lay people could also receive care. Monks educated in medicine could also visit the sick and wounded from surrounding villages and towns. A typical day for a monk was punctuated by prayer. It began early, shortly after midnight, with vigils. This was followed between 3 and 4 in the morning. By the first service, matins, then came prime at 6 a.m., followed by terce, 9 a.m., sext, noon, and none at 3 p.m. Vespers were held before sunset, and finally, half an hour after sunset, compline. After the morning mass, the brothers gathered in the chapter house to hear readings from the monastic rule. This was followed by sermons and discussions relevant to the monastery. Brothers confessed their sins, received discipline, or sought repentance. Between the morning mass, sext, and midday, they devoted themselves to work or study. Names and surnames. The period up to the 13th century was characterized by Slavonic names, mostly of pagan origin. Common people would keep names short and simple, like Odolen, the robust, Dobros, the good, Shval, the praised. Names were also given according to social status. Compound names like Dahomira, values peace, Boleslav, more famed, more fabled, and Ludmila, dear to the people, were reserved for royalty and nobility. Christian names were derived from Latin, Paul, Sylvester, Florian, Hebrew, James, Daniel, John, and Greek, Andrew, Nicholas, Peter. In the late Middle Ages, only names belonging to Christian martyrs were permitted. In the towns and countryside, names like John, Peter, Margaret, Catherine, and Anne were common, while the nobility retained the privilege of using names like Sophia, Elizabeth, Jakob, Ulrich, or Herman. Additional bynames added information about the location of the family seat, social or religious standing, or about relationships with relatives. For example, Divis z Talmberga in KCD Divish of Talmberg, Jan Petacek z Perkstein, Hans Capon of Perkstein, Hanush of Perkstein, son of Henry. In addition, sometimes an epithet would be used. For example, Jan Jazik Hannekenher of Baldek, Jan the Younger of Hradek. The growing population and limited number of first names led to the creation of modern surnames. The surname was derived from the place where the person lived, like in English, for example, hill, woods, forest. From their occupation, carter, miller, smith. From their physiognomy or appearance, ruddy, little, brown, or were patronymics derived from the father's forename, Davis, Little John, or matronymics derived from the mother's forename, Mariette Beaton. Ore merchants. Merchants played an important role in the developed mining process of Kuttenberg. Independent entrepreneurs known as mine ore merchants who bought ore from the king's vassals, feudal miners, or the miners themselves, and processed it on their own smelters. They smelted the mine ore and then were obliged to deliver the produced silver to the Kuttenberg Mint at an agreed price. Thus, they were important links in the entire process of silver production. The ore merchants were naturally aware of their importance in the mining industry, and therefore they founded their own association to protect their properties and interests. It was not uncommon for greed to lead the ore merchants to violate the law for their benefit. For example, secretly pressuring to lower the price of ore, thereby increasing their profits at the expense of the miners and the ruler. Papal legate, also known as apostolic nuncio. He is a representative and delegate of the papal throne defending its political interests. The legate is sent directly by the Pope to mediate negotiations with the king or to sit on a significant council. In addition to diplomatic power, the legate also had ecclesiastical power and could make decisions on internal church matters, such as establishing bishoprics or excommunicating offenders. Legates were held in high esteem, and even the monarch had to be wary of them, for according to medieval customs, secular power was appointed and consecrated by the church. St. John's Eve. St. John's Eve is one of the European folk tradition that takes place on the eve of the feast of St. John the Baptist, from the 23rd to the 24th of June. Although the name in some languages refers to a Christian celebration, it is actually a much older pagan custom. This night marks the celebration of an important moment in the year, the solstice, which is reflected in the name of its festival in Germanic and Scandinavian languages, such as Midsummer. Not the movie. The celebration of this festival takes place after sunset, ideally in nature, where people dance around the fire, sing, make merry, and participate in various rituals. Men jump over the fire, which symbolizes courage and skill. Women demonstrate their endurance by dancing around the maypole or seek their future husband through the tradition of floating a wreath of flowers. The girl must weave the wreath before midnight and then send it down the stream. The young man destined for her is the one who retrieves her wreath from the water. It was also believed that on St. John's Eve, herbs have the greatest power. Therefore, at this time, they were added to meals or brewed into healing infusions that could bring luck, love, or a bountiful harvest. According to tradition, a girl could also see the face of her chosen one if she placed 9 kinds of flowers under her pillow, which she had silently picked at night without looking back. The 9 herbs included daisy, rose, catchfly, cornflower, stonecrop, chickweed, thyme, violet, and bellflower. The concept of honor. The meaning of the word honor in the Middle Ages encompassed not only honesty, but particularly living in accordance with the conventions of one's status. An honorable craftsman was one who followed the guild's rules, attended church, and had no disreputable remarks made about him. Honor was sacred, and preserving it was a matter of prestige and social status. Losing one's honor meant ending up on the fringes of society. Thus, honor had to be not only built but also fiercely defended. Honor could be lost not only by transgressing social norms, such as having an illegitimate child or losing virginity before marriage, but also by violating unwritten conventions, such as shaking hands with an executioner, handling a dead body or carcass, or simply by failing to defend one's honor when it was challenged. In medieval perception, there was also so-called dishonorable people, those who had no honor at all. This group included executioners, naggers, prostitutes, and beggars. At certain times in history, millers were also considered dishonorable. Calling someone a sexual organ or an animal was not nearly as insulting as calling them dishonorable. Such insults often ended up before the bailiff, the court, or even in a duel. A special chapter is devoted to knightly honor, which was often a theme in literary works, and from today's perspective can seem almost comical. All right, let's move into crafts with beekeeping. During the Middle Ages, beekeeping was distinguished by how the honey was obtained, as either forest or domestic. The domestic beekeeper kept bees in hollow trees or in straw skeps, wickerwork hives, and were not subject to any regulation. Conversely, the forest beekeeper called Burtnik kept hives in the wild in hollowed-out trees. The forest beekeepers formed a fellowship similar to a guild and paid a fee to the owners of the woodland for each hive they managed. Beeswax was the main raw material for the production of candles up until the discovery of artificial wax, paraffin wax. Honey was used as a sweetener and fermented to make mead. Painters. The work of painters until the late Middle Ages primarily involved skillfully executing commissioned works rather than expressing the artist's personal vision. While they could decide on the technique of creation, they had little influence over the subject, colors, or size of the commissioned artwork. Apart from commissions for large-scale murals in sacred or ceremonial spaces, most painters devoted themselves mainly to decorating wooden furniture, ceilings, and even weapons. The most esteemed painters could showcase their skills in altar paintings. Classical canvas paintings, also as we know them today, were rare until the end of the 14th century and served more as a display of wealth than for decorative purposes. Paintings were often created in painters' workshops under the supervision of a master and involved the work of several painters who specialized in different parts of the painting: figures, ornaments, animals, backgrounds. Painting was seen more as a collaborative craft than an individual artistic endeavor. As a result, the names of specific artists from early paintings are largely unknown. Although the first signatures appeared in Italy as early as the 12th century, they did not become common in Central Europe until the turn of the 14th and 15th centuries. Therefore, to distinguish the prominent artists of Czech medieval paintings, auxiliary names referring to the places where their works were preserved are used, such as Master of the Visegrad altar, Master of the Trebon altar, or Master of the Litomeric altar. The names of the many monk artists who created the carefully crafted and exuberant illuminations in contemporary books and manuscripts will unfortunately never be known again. Smugglers. In the Middle Ages, smuggling was regarded as taking any goods in or out of a town without paying export or import duties. Smugglers had to know alternate routes and how to avoid tax collectors. When smuggling through the gates, they made use of false bottom vehicles or baskets, or even resorted to climbing over the walls by night. Contraband included fabrics, spices, wine, and other sacred goods subject to high taxation. Swordsmiths and armorers. Swordsmiths were originally blacksmith cutlers, specialized in blades for swords, knives, daggers, and other handheld sidearms. In the 14th century, the making of armor started to become specialized and separate from the blacksmith's craft. Specialist professions came into being: armorers, platesmiths, and helmet makers, who not only produced but also sold their wares. As regards weapons, there were new specialized professions: the swordsmith, bladesmith, fletcher, arrowsmith, and in later centuries, the gunsmith, bower, or shieldsmith, making wooden and metal shields. The price of a complete suit of armor was very high, affordable only to wealthy noblemen. Those who could not afford a complete suit of armor would have only partial metal armor and would rely on their agility for protection in combat. We only have one new event on here, the conquest of Kuttenberg. While Wenceslas was imprisoned in Vienna, Sigismund attacked Kuttenberg in December 1402. The city remained loyal to the king, and the miners in particular defended the city tenaciously. When they finally surrendered, they had to follow Sigismund to his camp at Kolin to kneel before him in the mud. Additionally, they had to pay him huge sums of money to prevent the city from being plundered. The surrounding villages were not so lucky, and many were looted or burned down. By capturing the city, Sigismund seized the largest silver deposits in the country, which enabled him to continue his campaign. The city's treasury contained valuable jewels as well as money, all of which fell prey to the enemy. When King Wenceslas IV returned to the throne, he estimated the wealth seized by Sigismund at 1 million gold coins of that period. At the time of our game, the city is under Sigismund's control, though the army itself is camped elsewhere. The top officials and members of the city council have been replaced, but otherwise the city has been left to its own self-government. And now to the last few locations. Brabant. The Duchy of Brabant was a geopolitical country located in the historic Netherlands on the territory between the rivers Zenne and Dender. Its founding was decided in 1183 by Frederick I Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor at the time. He elevated Count Henry I of Brabant to the position of Duke the Brabant Landgraviate. This political decision was intended to resolve the administrative confusion with the imperial fiefdom that had arisen after the death of the previous Count of Brabant, Herman II. In 1430, Philip III the Good inherited the duchy, which became part of the Burgundian Netherlands, along with Limburg and Lower Lotharingia, and then, from 1482, part of the Habsburg Netherlands. At the end of the 16th century, the Dutch revolt brought about the division of the territory of the Duchy of Brabant between the Netherlands and Belgium. Italian court. Originally, it was a fortified castle from the 13th century overseeing the safety of miners and the storage of mine materials. However, over time, the character of the building changed, and instead of a fortress, it began to perform a more lavish and representative function, although it was still the best guarded place in Kuttenberg. Massive reconstruction began under Wenceslas II, who centralized the production of coins, until now scattered throughout the kingdom, and started the minting of the Prague groschen, which was initially helped by the famous mint masters from Florence. The north of Italy was called Vlacci, hence the Vlasky Devur. The court thus became the equivalent of a central bank. Under Wenceslas IV, the mint underwent massive palace-style rebuilding and a chapel was added, but its purpose and exclusivity in terms of producing hard currency remained from the very beginning. High-quality coins of up to 94% pure silver content were minted here and quickly became a European stable currency. Today, Vlasky Devur is registered as a national cultural monument to the Czech Republic and houses a museum. The rich wall paintings of the court no longer exist, nor are there any preserved originals. The detail is rather artistic license on our part. Italy. In our historical epoch, Italy as we know it today did not exist yet. Instead, there were a number of independent states and kingdoms with their own rulers and politics, which were not unified until the 19th century. Among the most important of these are Lombardy, Tuscany, the Duchy of Venice, and the Papal State based in Rome. City-states or maritime republics often engaged in disputes and wars. The common bond at the time began mainly language and the legacy of ancient Rome, upon whose cultural foundation much of contemporary Europe was built. Due to its strategically important location in the heart of the Mediterranean, the territory of the Italian states was mainly focused on trade. Goods from Africa and the Arab world flowed through the region, and the local navy dominated the entire Mediterranean, serving as an indispensable transport force during, for instance, the Crusades. It is no exaggeration to say that a large portion of the exotic export goods available in the Czech lands had to pass through an Italian port. Beyond trade, however, the Italian kingdoms and principalities of the time also played a significant cultural role. It was here in our epoch that the long dominant discourse and philosophical and artistic movement called the Renaissance emerged. It must be added, however, that it took a few more decades for the Renaissance ideas to spread to the heart of Europe. Poland. In Poland, at the time of the 14th and 15th centuries, similar to the Czech lands, wars over governance, territory, and faith were occurring. The country's prosperity and its cultural and economic growth were particularly hampered by the relentless attacks of the Teutonic Knights from the so-called Crusader states on northern Polish territories, justified by the needs of the Christianization and suppression of the still dominant paganism in the Baltic region. Some of these sentences are freaking long. Unfortunately, Poland was not unified for long, because after the death of Casimir III the Great, the Piast dynasty, which had long unified and ruled the country, ended in the male line. The rule was taken by Casimir's cousin, Ludwig I of Anjou, the King of Hungary, but he struggled to gain the obedience of the Polish nobility, and his rule and ability to unite a larger coalition against the Crusader invasion was thus very limited. The most suitable solution eventually was the marriage of Ludwig's daughter, Hedwig, to Jagel, the Grand Duke of Lithuania. He took the name Vladislav, was accepted as the King of Poland, and along with the rest of Lithuania was baptized. This created the Polish-Lithuanian coalition, which significantly weakened the Teutonic Order. However, the Crusaders did not want to give up so easily, and the war continued for many more years. A turning point in this conflict was the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, in which the Teutonic forces were decisively defeated by the Polish-Lithuanian army. Many Czech fighters fought on the side of the Poles at the time, including Jan Žižka and Jan Sokol of Lamberg. Prague, capital of the Kingdom of Bohemia. For many centuries, it was rather a close neighborhood of several different towns on both banks of the Vltava River. Its greatest prosperity was brought about by Charles IV, who united these towns in a single unit and made it the residence of his imperial court. He began building strong fortifications, contributed to significant changes in the city's architecture, started the construction of the first Czech cathedral, and founded the first European university north of the Alps, Charles University, thus elevating the city to a European metropolis. At the time of the 14th and 15th centuries, according to surviving records, there were 4,000 houses in Prague, with a permanent population ranging from 40 to 50,000. Additionally, there were students and the royal court. Although Prague could not compare to the size of Florence or Paris, it was still the largest city in Central Europe. With its convenient location at the crossroads of trade routes, Prague was an important trading location and, thanks to the university, a cosmopolitan center with a large foreign population. Shitoki. I can't remember how to pronounce this one. The first written mention of the village Shitoki dates back to 1141. According to which it was in possession of the Olomouc Archdiocese. In 1249, Shitoki was briefly held by Havel of Lauenburg, and a year later, the Olomouc Bishop Bruno of Schauenburg ceded the village to Sedlitz Monastery. In the 14th century, the farmstead and part of the village belonged to various partition families from Kuttenberg, such as André Puce, under whom a Gothic fortress was added. In 1397, Wenceslas Bartosz, Vaclav Bartosz, became the owner and pledged to pay a permanent fee to the Kuttenberg almshouse from the farmstead. After the Hussite Wars, Hanisch Freyden held Shitoki, burdening the farmstead and fortress with many debts which he refused to pay. So in 1443, the chief master decided that Hanisch and his descendants, from now on and for all time, had to pay 50 dozen groschen to Kuttenberg almhouse every year. The last burgher to own Shitoki was Vorsila Sihelnikova, who sold the estate to Vaclav Materna of Vetnis in 1501. The Maternus rebuilt the Gothic fortress in the Renaissance style. To this day, only the Gothic vaulted cellar remains, though in a very poor condition. Raborsch Fortress. The first written mention of Raborsch appears in 1362. At that time, the adjacent village belonged to Mikolaus Velkus, a townsman from Kuttenberg who sold it to Mikolaus Wunderbrut between 1386-1389. The rapid change of owners is characteristic of the fortress even to this day. After his death, it passed to King Wenceslas XIV, from whom it was acquired by another Kuttenberg burgher, Martin Odorin. In 1402, the fortress and the village were burnt down by King Sigismund of Hungary during the siege of Kuttenberg. The remains of the fortress continued to change hands during the 15th century until they came under the administration of King George of Podiebrad, and from there to the captain of Kolin, Jan Hraban, at Prerognis. The list of subsequent owners is extensive. Today, the fortress, rebuilt into a castle, is privately owned. Only part of the masonry of the southeastern corner and one room with a rib vaulting have been preserved from the original Gothic building. Sedlitz Monastery. The Sedlitz Monastery used to be the oldest Cistercian abbey in Czech Kingdom. Founded by the Bavarian abbot Gerlach in 1142, it was later abandoned and reoccupied many times in its history, either due to wars or poor financial situations. In 1421, it was burned down by the Hussites. Only the Church of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary and St. John the Baptist survived. After the end of the war, only a few monks returned, and it remained in this dismal state until the 17th century. In 1783, the monastery was completely abolished by an imperial decree. The cemetery Church of All Saints with the adjacent burial grounds was originally part of the monastery, but later it began to serve as the municipal cemetery for Kuttenberg, because as records shown, burials were taking place there long before the arrival of the monks. The cemetery was at its busiest during wars and plague epidemics. In 1318 alone, 30,000 dead were buried there, and another 10,000 during the Hussite Wars. The site is shrouded in many legends. The most famous one states that the abbot of the Heidenreich monastery brought a handful of dirt from Jerusalem on his pilgrimage to the Holy Land, which he then scattered around the cemetery and the ossuary. Thus, the cemetery ground became sacred and highly sought after, not only by the people of Kuttenberg, but also by the pilgrims and other wishing to be buried there from all over Bohemia and neighboring regions. Who wouldn't want to rest in the ground where Jesus Christ himself once walked. Today, a cigarette factory is located on the site of the former monastery. Sedlet's Ossuary. The ossuary is an underground chapel of All Saints Cemetery Church built in the second half of the 14th century, which originally belonged to the Cistercian Abbey in Sedlec. It bears an uncanny resemblance to the underground chapels of Jerusalem, where pilgrims were buried. During the Hussite Wars, the monastery was burnt down and abandoned together with the ossuary. It was not rebuilt until the second half of the 15th century. In 1511, the bones from the cemetery were exhumed and moved to the ossuary's underground, where a half-blind monk put them together into famous pyramids and bone structures. In our game, however, we decided to attribute their creation to Henry. In its later history, the Sedlec ossuary underwent Baroque modifications, and today it is one of the most popular tourist sites in the Czech Republic. The bone structures, made from the remains of more than 60,000 people, have undergone extensive renovation, and as a memento mori are still a reminder that thus thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return. St. Barbara's Cathedral. Construction of the church dedicated to St. Barbara began in 1388 when local wealthy miners, townspeople, and patrician families decided that the town needed a representative sanctuary. Intermittent construction and alterations continued until the beginning of the 20th century. Fortunately, always with sensitivity and respect for the original Gothic style. The Cathedral of St. Barbara is one of the 4 cathedrals in Bohemia, and the fact that the building was funded by the townspeople and not by the church was later reflected in its unique decoration. The original Gothic paintings depict miners and craftsmen from the smelters in addition to classical church motifs. Later additions such as stained glass windows, added since the early 20th century with the latest from 2014, depict not only saints but also figures performing various modern professions. In the game, you can find many references to the cathedral from townspeople and guild members, from whom the construction of the cathedral was a matter of prestige. The wealthy competed to immortalize themselves in the decoration through generous sponsorship, including securing specific altars. Space and the number of altars were limited, so only the most generous could leave their mark in history. The Devil's Den. The Devil's Den is still today one of the smallest settlements in the Kuttenberg region. This is a real place? Oh. Unfortunately, no record of its appearance in 1403 have survived, but in the 16th century, the infamous Devil's Tavern stood on its site, where the lowlifes of Kuttenberg often gathered, and which served as a model for our Devil's Den. The name of the settlement and the tavern comes from a legend according to which devils were said to come out of the local mines and fly over Kuttenberg at midnight. They were only driven from their dens by water, which later flooded the mines. We also learned about the dark characters of the former inn from the memoirs of Mikulas Dakiki Mikal, a messenger of the mining authority, killed the innkeeper Saint Stasny with a spear in the Devil's Tavern near Kuttenberg. Oh my god. Where there were a den of rogues and whores, they were fighting over some gloves. Okay, is this Wisoka or Waisoka? I feel like Waisoka. It is the hill where in 1142 a memorable battle took place between King Vladislav II and Prince Conrad of Znojmo, supported by the rebellious nobility. The king suffered a great loss due to the treachery of his own people. In the 13th century, an early Gothic church dedicated to the Visitation of the Virgin Mary was built on the hill, which has survived almost unchanged to the present day. Today, at the summit, an elevation of 471 meters above sea level, stands an outlook tower with a beautiful view of the surrounding area. Zimburg. Settlement in the area date back to the late Stone Age, around 3000 BC. Today, however, only traces of an early medieval fortified settlement remain in the form of remnants of moats and visible ramparts. Some historians, as well as folk legend, claim that Kimberg Castle, owned by the lords of Zimburg, once stood here and was even perhaps their ancestral home. Later, the descendants of the family built 2 more castles with the same name, Kimberg in Ternavka and Novi Kimberg in Korikana. Unfortunately, nothing remains from the original castle, hence why some historians claim that such a castle never stood there and the settlement rather got its name from the nearby mine that belonged to Zimburg family. Nevertheless, we decided to depict it in this game. All right, and that is it for our Codex catch-up. As you can see, I still have some missing, like 79 out of 86, 27 out of 31, 60 out of 67, 32 out of 35, 6 out of 8, 34 out of 35. I'm not sure whether that is because there are additional ones in the DLC. I have a feeling because I haven't seen everything, like it's hard to 100% a game the first time you pick it up. It's probably also buried in books somewhere. So I will do another little mini catch up of me just reading the books that I have, because I have quite a few left over that I wasn't getting to because I was so absorbed in the story. We'll see if that opens up more codexes. Anyways, thank you all for watching. I hope you learned something new today. I certainly did. And until the next one, take care.